Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Baines. I am the president of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable NGO dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. Not many Canadians have to consider this as an aspect of their everyday lives. We're here to make sure that they do. These conversations about Canada's role internationally, multilateralism, and of course NATO and the rest of the rules-based order are really important to make sure Canadians understand the foundations of their own day-to-day flourishing. The maintenance of peace, prosperity, and security is not something that's natural. It takes work and effort. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the possible expansion of NATO as that blanket of security, that dedication of one for all and all for one. 30 nations at the moment, continually looking to have an open door policy and perhaps expand. Now we're going to talk a little bit today about what that possibility might be for Ukraine. Canada has been very supportive of this process. And I think the great thing that we get to hear about today from our guest, Hanna Hopko, is what are the values of NATO? Why should Canadians remind themselves about this amazing organization? Why should they really reassess how amazingly lucky we are to be part of such an organization? And so today we're going to have a wonderful discussion, and I'm pleased to introduce Arjun Singh, one of our research analysts at the NATO Association of Canada and a great member of our team, to introduce Hanna and to start the discussion. Thanks so much. Arjun, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert, and to all our viewers in Canada and around the world, welcome to our event, quote, A Sour Grape, Ukrainian NATO Membership, a discussion with Dr. Hanna Hopko, a former member of the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada, that's the Ukrainian parliament, and chairman of its Foreign Affairs Committee from 2014 to 2019. My name is, of course, Arjun Singh. As Robert mentioned, I'm a research analyst with the association, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Just at the outset, I'd like to direct everyone to what Robert just mentioned about the subject that we're discussing today. As you can see over my shoulder, there are 30 flags arranged row on row under, of course, the NATO aegis. And that really symbolizes what our alliance is about. NATO is an organization that seeks peace through strength, and strength comes through numbers, which is why NATO membership has been something that's been hotly debated and has always been a burgeoning positive topic for the alliance. We've always sought to expand our family of nations, our alliance of nations, working together with collective strength to ensure that peace, prosperity, security, and the rules-based international order remain strong and resilient across Europe, but also in our periphery, and as the locus from which it radiates all the world over. And Ukraine's NATO membership is a subject that has gained increased attention as of late, given the events since 2014. For those who are not familiar or perhaps may have forgotten, in 2014, the Russian Federation illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine, and that marked the first movement of Russian military forces as well as its territorial ambitions and acquisitions westward since the end of the Cold War. It was a watershed moment and a disruption in the balance of power that was maintained since the end of the Cold War in 1991. And that's caused a lot of convulsions both within the alliance and amongst the European community regarding geopolitical stability. Ukraine has sought to become a NATO member so as to join this family of nations in as part of its commitment to peace, security, stability, and the international order. Of course, that has not been welcomed by everyone, and thus it makes for a lively debate, which we are here to get into today. And for that, I am pleased to welcome our very special guest, Dr. Hanna Hopko, who is a distinguished politician, academic, journalist, and a social reform thinker in Ukrainian society. She was born in Hanachivka in Lviv Oblast in the then Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic back before the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Iron Curtain. In 2004, she received a Master of Arts from Lviv University, and in 2009, a Doctorate of Philosophy from Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv in political communications. During this time, she worked as a journalist with Inter TV, Lux Radio, and the first national TV channel where she reported on corruption, public health, environmental protection, and a host of other issues across Ukraine and Central Asia. It's 2014, as I mentioned before, a very pivotal year for Ukraine, where Hopko became one of the leading young activists in the country as part of the Euromaidan Movement, which was a year-long series of protests against corruption, alleged human rights violations, and oligarchy under the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych, which resulted in his removal from office and absconding from the country. In new elections to the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament of Ukraine, Hopko led the party list of the Union Self-Reliance Party and was elected as a people's deputy. Belated congratulations, Doctor. She was then appointed chair of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, which oversaw multiple portfolios and files in Ukraine's post-2014 foreign relations, including its ratification of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and legislation that realigned Ukraine's foreign relations towards closer ties with NATO, the European Union, and the Western family of nations away from pro-Russian policies. And these were undertaken under the Yatsenyuk-II and the Groysman governments after 2014. Following her departure from the Self-Reliance Party in 2015 for supporting constitutional amendments for greater federalization, she retired in politics in 2019. And since then has chaired Democracy in Action, a group that works to combat corruption in Ukraine with the Anti-Corruption Action Center. These are a group of NGOs that support political reform efforts to, as I said, combat corruption, ensure greater competition, and remove monopolies in the country to make Ukraine a more free and democratic society. She was named a leading global thinker by Foreign Policy in magazine in 2014 and has previously participated in the World Economic Forum, the Warsaw Security Forum, and the Munich Security Conference. Dr. Hopko, suffice it to say, you have a wealth of experience, which we are very happy to have brought to us today and are looking forward to hearing from. I welcome you to the event and invite you to say a few words. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert and Anjun, and it's a big honor for me today to discuss with you a very important issue, and I'm so thankful to the NATO Association of Canada for having me today, and I hope we will have very fruitful discussion, and I'm ready to answer on all your questions. And now I do represent an Ukrainian NGO, the National Advocacy Network ENDS, and we are planning, or we intend to organize in autumn this year a NATO Parliamentary Assembly model for young Ukrainians, involving dozens of students, government and parliamentary decision makers from Ukraine and from NATO member countries. Why it's important? Because, as you might know, that in May 2020, next year, for the first time ever, the Parliamentary Assembly NATO session will be held in Kyiv. And by that time, we want to build a community of young leaders who will understand how the key democratic mechanism of NATO decision-making operates in multinational environment. So I will be so happy to continue my cooperation with NATO Association of Canada in future projects of my organization and with Ukrainian society.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And that's absolutely delightful to hear. A NATO simulation is something that we here in Canada under the NATO Association have previously organized. And in our experience, it's an absolutely wonderful program for young people to learn more about the rules-based international order and about the workings of this very important alliance. So our congratulations to you for that endeavor. And we are sure it will be a very successful one when it's held in Kyiv. And that itself is sort of symbolic of the fact that Ukraine is top of mind for NATO, and NATO is one of the most important issues that currently face Ukraine and its foreign relations. As I mentioned at the outset, it's currently seeking to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to participate in our collective defense programs. And so for viewers who are not as familiar with Ukrainian geopolitics and the history of Ukraine and the conditions that have led it to this moment to seek NATO, given your experience and the position in which you now sit, could you Tell us why Ukraine needs to become a NATO member state. What are the factors that have driven it to this decision? And why is it important for Ukraine's security going forward?
Thank you for this question. But before answering, I would prefer to start with mentioning that this year we will celebrate in August 24 the 30th anniversary of renewed independence when Soviet Union was collapsed. And for the first time in our history, in 311 years, the original version of the Latin language constitution of Hetman Philip Orlik arrived in Ukraine, and everybody who visits Ukraine, I'm encouraging to see the historical exhibit, which is now in the St. Sophia Cathedral, and why it's really important and it's so unique. Because this is the constitution, this constitution is the first constitution in world from 1710, almost 311 years old, was prepared by our Hetman Philip Orlik. And in this constitution, you could see determine the foundations of the state power, the form of government. And I think it's also one of the contribution of Ukraine from that times to the global constitutional process, which is really important. And also the temporary display will be in a St. Sophia Cathedral. For those who never visited Kyiv, I would like, or I'm inviting to search in Google and to get more information about St. Sophia Cathedral, why it's so important. In 2014, when Vice President Biden visited Ukraine, and I made an excursion for him, and I told him it was St. Michael Cathedral, said, dear President, dear Vice President, could you please look at the St. Michael Cathedral? And why it's so unique? Because when Putin says that Ukraine is an artificial state, we often refer to St. Sophia Cathedral, which was built at the beginning of 11th century when Moscow didn't exist. So this is also, since we are celebrating 30 years of renewed independence, but the history and tradition of Ukraine's struggle for our country, statehood has more than 1,000 years of period from Kievan Rus. And also because the Putin produced a lot of articles recently about one nation, that Russians and Ukrainians, it's one people and others. This is why we need to know the history, not to allow authoritarian regimes to produce manipulations. And also this year, also very important year. Why? Because Moscow imperial behavior began centuries ago and continues today. This year will be the 300th anniversary of renaming of what had been known as the Grand Duchy of Moscow, or Moscovia, as the Russian Empire by Peter I. By the way, Peter I is a favorite political leader of Russian President Vladimir Putin. And yet the very name was filched from an agent entity, Kievan Rus, a great power in Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages and the direct ancestor of today's Ukrainian nation. By appropriating its legacy through this lie, Peter tried to lend legitimacy to his claim to rule over the neighbors. So actually, for centuries, Moscovia, then Soviet Union, and Russian Federation now, they are trying to grab the history and also occupy the territories. And the most painful period of Russian domination came with the victory of communism and establishment of a totalitarian state called USSR. For almost 80 years, Ukrainians lived in a country that invented facts, spread lies, and imprisoned people for telling the truth. So why this background matters and it's important? Because Ukraine, within last 30 years, not just survived as an independent state, Ukraine is a democracy in action. Compared to what's going on now in Belarus, when dictator Lukashenko is repressing people and with help from Putin. And also the situation in Russian Federation with poisoning of Navalny and also persecution of indigenous people and also killing their political opponents. So it's also, we have to say that Putin wages war against democratic world by temporary occupation of Georgia territory since 2008, then temporary occupation of Crimea since 2008, and actually ongoing war in eastern Ukraine. Also, we have to mention the militarization with nuclearization of Crimea, which poses a threat for the whole Europe and Mediterranean. Also, downing of MH17 in 2014, intimidating and repressing the ethnic minority of Crimean Tatars, also refusing to withdraw Russian troops and weapons from occupied Donbass, cyber attacks against foreign critical infrastructure, then restrictions of navigation through the Kerch Strait in the Black Sea, then killing at least 21 journalists since taking power in 2000. So meddling in the US elections, then assassinations of Kazankoshvili in Germany in 2014, and poisoning his opponents like Litvinenko and many people in Bulgaria, Novichok, poisoning by Novichok. So the list of Putin's aggressive behavior against Western civilization, attacking human rights, and also is endless. And unfortunately, we have somehow we have to think how to stop Putin, because it's very dangerous for the whole Western civilization. So Ukraine is a critical partner on the front line of Russian military aggression. Russian military aggression is a threat for the whole Europe and stability of the international order. And of course, Ukraine, through modernization of its armed forces, is now countering Russian hybrid warfare. And our contribution is also important, that our people feel that they are also secure, because everybody knows about the Budapest Memorandum. When Ukraine received renewed independence, we gave up the third largest nuclear power. And in return, we expected to receive as security guarantees. Unfortunately, in 2014, we realized that only Ukrainian volunteers and army are the true guarantors of our territorial integrity and sovereignty. And of course, Ukraine highly appreciates the fact that NATO member states remain committed to the 2008 Bucharest summit decisions on Ukraine's future membership in the alliance. And a lot of talks after 2018, but still there is no progress in receiving membership action plan. However, Ukraine, with NATO support, achieved a lot and managed to reform defense and security sector, adopted a law on national security, on defense procurement, and many others. So I think that since the NATO summit in Bucharest, the geopolitical situation in the region has dramatically changed. As I mentioned before, the war in Georgia 2008, then Russian ongoing armed aggression against Ukraine since 2014, and currently Russia is continuing passportization of Ukrainian citizens in the temporarily occupied territories, and also Putin is ready to give Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens, also trying to destabilize situation inside Ukraine. So I think also a significant deterioration of the security situation in the Black Sea, also further sliding of Belarus in the orbit of the Russian Federation. So we could say that not just Russia, but also the economic expansionism of China and current situation in Afghanistan So, and in Myanmar, in Hong Kong and others. So we could say that now we have to think collectively how to restore the power of democracy. And since Ukraine is a democracy in action, so the success of Ukraine matters for the whole Western civilization, because I think the West needs an international story for democracy, and Ukraine is a place to get it. And also, let me be answering on your question, why Ukraine? What is the Ukraine's contribution to the security of North Atlantic area? Ukraine's commitment to NATO's democratic values. So I participated in the Orange Revolution and then in the Dignity Revolution. So Ukrainians prevented the establishment of an authoritarian regime in Ukraine in 2004 and in 2014. So actually we didn't allow Putin to influence the domestic policy of Ukraine and also to establish here the authoritarian regime. Also, unprecedented contribution to the global nuclear disarmament. As I mentioned, in 1994, Ukraine abandoned the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. Also, example with the pandemic COVID-19. Pandemic assistance. In the first half of 2020 alone, Ukraine aircraft transported about 950 tons of medical cargo, because Ukraine is also, we have the biggest airplane in the world, titled Mria 2025 or the Dream 2025. So it was also our contribution to the pandemic situation recovery, and also participation in the alliance missions and operations. And here I have to just to say this, because Ukraine is the only NATO partner country that has taken part in all major allied operations and missions. So since 1992, Ukraine's armed forces have taken part in 26 international peacekeeping and humanitarian missions. Ukraine units, over 44,000 service members in total, have played important roles supporting operations in Angola, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Congo, Ethiopia, Kuwait, Afghanistan, and Georgia. So it's already we are very closely participating in alliance missions. Also, valuable experience combating hybrid threats. Russian hybrid aggression against Ukraine consists of different elements like crypto war, disinformation, propaganda, conventional war. So in 2016, at the Warsaw Summit, NATO Warsaw Summit, the Ukraine NATO platform against hybrid warfare was introduced. And actually, within all these 8 years of Russian ongoing warfare, so we learned a lot how to counter cybersecurity attacks on critical infrastructure, how to stop fakes from Russia, counter disinformation, and this is how we could contribute. And also real combat experience and combat capabilities. So Ukraine exchanges its combat experience gained in the war with Russia in the framework of joint exercise with NATO members. And I think it's really very important, because this is how we could contribute, not being even the NATO members. And also, let mention you regarding our expenditures, more than 2% of GDP towards defense spending. In 2020, Ukraine's defense spending was 3% of the GDP, with security and defense totaling to 5.5%. And also interoperability with NATO. Ukraine has implemented 19% of NATO standards, which is close to or more than that of some of recent NATO members. And my last point, the Ukrainian army occupies 25th place out of 133 countries, according to the annual survey of the web resource Global Firepower, which publishes an estimate of the total military power of each country in the world based on 50 indicators. Among the European countries, it is in the 8th place among NATO member states, 10. According to the quantitative indicators of the active military personnel in 2021, Ukraine ranks 22 out of 255,000. So among the allies, the United States is only ahead of Ukraine, 1.4 million, Turkey 355,000, and France 270,000. At the same time, today, the Ukrainian armed forces no longer resemble the post-Soviet army. The armed forces are well armed with the new modern models of armaments and military equipment. And of course, since 2008, the level of public support for our country's Euro-Atlantic progress, which has already reached more than 50%, has changed significantly. An important fact is the formation of a stable core of support in Ukraine, which does not change. So, and as you know, in 2019, during the period I used to work in the parliament, we incorporated into our constitution our strategic foreign policy goal, one day to become a member of NATO. So I hope these arguments, how Ukraine is contributing to the NATO and also to the security of North Atlantic area are powerful enough that we deserve one day to become a NATO member. And Arjun, I hope one day behind you, there will be one more flag of Ukraine. And definitely we will strengthen the alliance by sharing our experience, unique experience of Ukrainian soldiers.
I have to say, Hanna, that's really an overwhelming answer with a blitzkrieg of arguments to shoot down any incoming Russian verbal silos, so to speak. And thank you for that. It's quite informative, and there's a lot to unpack there. Some of the themes that I think were quite salient were, as you mentioned at the start, the effort to rewrite history and alter the way we conceptualize certain geographic spaces. I think that is really the premise for all arguments and Russian efforts, both physical as well as political and military, against Ukraine. And that's something that we've not just seen in this theater, but all around the world. So it's very important that we are mindful against that. And I'm glad that you brought it up. Of course, your summary of Russia's various destabilizing actions, they are well known to people, but it's good to have that refreshed. When Ronald Reagan described the Soviet Union as an evil empire, I can see how that lineage has sort of continued in terms of the destabilizing actions that have since been perpetrated against Ukraine, as well as other nations and individuals who are seeking democracy, freedom, the values that you described as Ukraine being the embodiment of as a democracy in action. And certainly what you said regarding Ukraine's various contributions, its experiences dealing with Russia, its military spending levels, which are quite important and have gotten lots of attention within the alliance. I think you do make a compelling case for how there is not just a need for Ukraine to be a member of NATO, but also for NATO to have Ukraine as a member of the alliance. And there's a lot that can be given and taken from Ukraine in a fruitful partnership over there. So, like I said, that is a compelling case, but it does not appear, at least within the current climate, that all member states and entities affiliated with them would necessarily agree, because at the most recent NATO summit that was held in Brussels after a while because of COVID-19, Ukraine's NATO membership was a principal subject of discussion. And we did observe that several NATO member states, including some particularly prominent ones, did not agree to Ukraine's swift accession, despite the compelling case that you make and others have made. They've instead claimed that internal reforms, quote unquote, such as anti-corruption measures, for instance, are necessary. And they're making these arguments in spite of all the destabilizing actions that you mentioned, the annexation of Crimea, the events of the Donbass, the activities in Belarus, the poisoning of various opposition leaders and journalists, and in some cases, their tragic death, that are all linked to the Russian Federation, separatism in Eastern Moldova, which is pretty close to the Ukrainian theater and elsewhere. So this is a bit odd, where the certain member states to whom I refer are not accepting Ukraine's swift accession in spite of these destabilizing events. So in the midst of this and the apparent sort of disjunct between these elements, I wonder what you think explains the reason why NATO member states are still dragging their feet, so to speak. Are they simply calling for internal reforms to delay membership for political reasons, or is there some legitimacy to the arguments that they're making? What do you think?
Thanks for this question, because in 2008 and now in 2021, we could say that open door policy is, we have like the doors are open, but Russia and Russian European proxies are staying in this door, not allowing Ukraine and Georgia to enter. Because following up the results of the NATO summit in Bucharest, no decision was taken to grant Ukraine and NATO membership action plan, taking into account the categorical position of a number of leading allies like Germany, France, mostly due to the following arguments: unwillingness to provoke Russia, which considers NATO's approach to its own borders as a threat to national security. And second, the ambiguity of Ukrainian civil society's attitude towards the Euro-Atlantic prospects of the Ukrainian state. But as I mentioned earlier, compared to 2008, now in Ukraine, more than 50% of Ukrainians support Ukraine's future as a member of NATO. And by the rate of support of the accession to NATO by Ukrainians is even higher than in some NATO member states like France, 38%, Slovakia, Bulgaria. So compared to 2008, now we have much higher support among Ukrainian society. Plus, we have political consensus, and we incorporated into the constitution our strategic goal. Plus, now Ukrainian army is one of the strongest army at the European continent. So Ukraine is contributed to the Euro-Atlantic area and security. And of course, there are the same countries which are creating artificial arguments, not ready to, not ready to allow Ukraine to move forward, even if we understand that granting membership action plan, and last year Ukraine became an enhanced opportunity partnership program, enhanced opportunity program partner. And so the next steps, membership action plan would be very important. And even if we understand that MAP is not the entrance to NATO, it's a motivational tool to speed up with reforms and even to pursue more. So I hope that we have to talk about the risk of not inviting Ukraine to NATO. Because in 2008, not inviting Georgia and Ukraine to NATO, not providing membership action plan, it's allowed Moscow, it's allowed Russia to invade in 2000 Georgia and then Ukraine. And I have to remind you that Ukraine at that time, we had neutrality status. Like no political readiness to move forward with NATO integration policies. And now it's totally different situation, but it seems like Ukraine has to intensify our diplomatic work with those nations and provide them arguments why it's important to deliver more what was promised in 2008 to Ukraine. Because actually the risk of NATO enlargement is often discussed inside and outside the alliance. And also what could be the consequences for the region and Atlantic security from not inviting Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance. Of course, threat to the statehood, disappointment of voters binding the country's future with NATO and the EU will increase the influence of pro-Russian politicians and also pro-Russian. Even now, with the situation in Afghanistan, we analyzed how Russian propaganda is trying to use this situation to spread anti-American, anti-Western mood. And also, there is a risk that we will have the lack of a clear roadmap for membership, which will affect the pace of reforms implementation, at least in the spheres of security and defense. So membership action plan, which is not the real entrance to the NATO, but for us and for our political elites, for civil society, for our veterans community, this will be an extra push to develop a roadmap with very clear priorities like judiciary reform, anti-corruption, defense and security, the continued decentralization reform, so and to achieve more progress. And of course, Russia will perceive it has a de facto veto in NATO. Russia will perceive the post-Soviet space as its area of privileged interest. New aggressive actions towards Ukraine and Georgia, also because you remember that this year build-up of Russian military in the Ukrainian border and in Crimea. So this was this was how Putin blackmailed the West, and especially Mr. Biden, after Biden said that Putin is a killer. And then we've seen how immediately the build-up at the border with Ukraine, and Putin was blackmailing Ukraine with readiness to start new attacks or new aggressive. So actually, it's really important that the West supports Ukraine and also Georgia. And expansion of the Russian threat on the NATO border. I think it's also important for NATO consider the risks all this postponement. And I hope that within the NATO 2030 strategy, we will see the room for further discussion. And if Ukraine delivers, and I also hope that our president visit, Mr. Zelensky visit to Washington at the end of August with the package of priority reforms and or clear roadmap, will also mobilize the support Ukraine delivers these reforms. Then during the NATO summit in Madrid in 2022, we could be more closer to membership action plan. And this decade, 2030, this will be the decade when Ukraine join NATO, which will be in benefit of both Ukraine and the alliance.
Well, thank you very much for that answer, Hanna. And certainly of course, mutual benefit has already been established. One argument that I think you mentioned in this recent answer, which I think is quite important, is the fact that if our alliance is to be based on peace through strength, then we do have to show strength. We cannot be afraid of Russia's threats against our territorial integrity or to our partners, Ukraine being one of them, if we are to continue the work of expansion. And so whether it's on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which recently you've been critical of, as have I, or other decisions. We need to take decisions from a standpoint of strength and not be afraid of threats, verbal or otherwise, that are leveled against us. So I think that's a very important point. But just to go back to the question of internal reforms and corruption, which is something that you have worked on and other NATO member states have identified as a big concern. Ukraine is currently considered the second most corrupt country in Europe after Russia, according to Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. Corruption was, of course, what the Euromaidan movement, of which you were a leader, was about. It was directed against that. And sadly, there probably was substantial change from the pre-2014 to the post-2014 Ukrainian landscape in terms of corruption, but it still persists. And so based on your current efforts to combat corruption, and you've been very active in organizing conferences and leading NGOs in that direction, I'm wondering if you can give us an update as to what is the current state of anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine, and what is the plan that you're pursuing to wrest control of Ukraine's political institutions from oligarchic corruption, and when can we expect that to be done to a certain point where it would be satisfactory to NATO member states in their demands right now? What do you think of that?
Thank you for these important questions. And I also visited Transparency International Corruption Index for 2020, because I was wondering who is on the most transparent countries in the world. But when I found that Belarus is on the 63 position in corruption index, but knowing what's going on now in Belarus, so really, I think it's on the one hand, it's good to know that Belarus is far from Ukraine in fighting corruption, but I prefer to live in Ukraine and help the Belarusian activists to win over the dictators. So in Ukraine, it's of course not easy to destroy the monopolies of oligarchs, which are competing with each other. Besides oligarchic influence, of course, there's attempts of influence from Russian Federation, and as you might have heard, that this February, Ukrainian president banned Kremlin reports. It's not TV channels, not media, because this was just a very, the channels of toxic propaganda against Ukraine. And can you imagine that we analyzed with the Institute of Mass Information last year and this year, the narratives related to the interiority of Ukraine as a state where most often external control, Ukraine is a Nazi state, Ukraine is a failed state. So there were lots of pro-Russian narratives, like Ukraine is a non-state, and also there were anti-Western narratives that Ukraine remains under external control. This narrative is the most popular among those people who still tend to have some nostalgia for Soviet Union. So this is why, to cut the influence, negative influence of Russian Federation, we had to ban so-called Russian media channels. And another way of how we also fight with Russian attempts to control Ukraine via church, you know that Ukraine received in 2018, Ukrainian Orthodox Church received an autocephaly. So now we have independent Ukrainian church, no influence from Moscow. Before there were different how Moscow church in Ukraine were used in domestic policies to destabilize Ukraine inside our country. So corruption is also a tool for our enemy to destabilize Ukraine. So this is why, starting from the Revolution of Dignity, we were focusing on key reforms like decentralization, to destroy the vertical power. Well, all resources from national level were going to local with all bribes, corruption. We destroyed all the schemes by creation and amalgamated communities or independent local communities responsible for their development, for investment. Also, we amended our tax and budget codes, providing them more financial independence. Also, we established an anti-corruption infrastructure, like we established National Anti-Corruption Bureau, National Agency of Prevention Corruption, which deals with electronic declarations of politically exposed people. And our e-declaration system is one of the most progressive in the world. Also, e-procurement, when it's via internet, you could organize tenders, and not like before used to be a tons of papers when you could have some schemes. So we avoid these corrupted schemes in this sector. Also in defense and security sector, we adopted a law on procurement in defense, and now are preparing for the second reading the law on state security service with the key international partners from NATO, US, Canada. They are working as advisory members in Verkhovna Rada, Ukrainian parliament. So it's not destroy all corrupted schemes even within 7 years after the dignity revolution, but the key for us to build strong institutions and also judiciary reform, to have independent politically court system and not corrupt, and also independent from Russian influence, because we also have seen some examples when Russian money were invested in Ukrainian courts. So it's really important to clean the whole system from Russian corruption, like gas deals, and you mentioned, and thanks for mentioning Nord Stream 2, because for Ukraine, it's not about exporting gas from Russia, it's about export of corruption to the European Union. And we are doing our best to stop Nord Stream 2 and not to allow to launch this project, because Nord Stream 2 is economically unnecessary and environmentally destructive project. And also Nord Stream 2 does not facilitate diverse energy mix in Europe. And the majority of European Union of Europe oppose Nord Stream 2. So there are many arguments also against Nord Stream 2. And we don't want to see how the US and Germany are investing their efforts in strengthening the monopoly of Russia in the gas system, and then have more political monopoly or political control. Because definitely Russia's desire to build a new pipeline to the EU is a desire for monopoly control of gas transportation routes, and has a political motivation. So with it's fighting against corruption is ongoing process in Ukraine. And the key is here to build strong anti-corruption institutions, politically independent, which will deliver results and guarantee the transparency. And also we adopted a law in electoral code providing state financing for political parties, also not to give a chance for oligarchs to provide money for political parties, because it was typical and still is for Ukraine that oligarchs, they are financing political projects, and then they have their people in the parliament and government to lobby their interests. So which is probably not just in Ukraine, there are rich people behind political process, but in Ukraine, when we have Russian ongoing war, it's a problem of national security. This is why the more we progress in our fight with corruption, the better situation, the more secure we will be, and our enemies could not attack us by bribing politicians, by investing in propaganda via their channels.
So thank you very much, Hanna, for that answer. And I think the gist of it, that we should look at corruption from a transnational perspective as not being localized to Ukraine, but with links to Russia, is certainly a very valuable contribution and affects the way perspectives will perhaps be shaped in the future. And we could go on in terms of this discussion about the various facets, but we do have to get to some of our audience questions. Our audience has been waiting patiently and eagerly, and they've dropped some very informative and thought-provoking questions. So again, think in the interest of time, we can perhaps have some brief answers to them and get the doubts resolved as well as the ideas addressed. And the first comes from Adwait Sharma, who asks, quote, could you speak to the impact of internal divisions in Ukraine, for example, the East being somewhat pro-Russian in matters of Ukrainian foreign policy? I assume he refers to the activities in the Donbass. And what are your thoughts on those divisions within Ukraine on the questions of foreign policy that you've mentioned?
Sorry, could you repeat at the beginning, which divisions?
The divisions in foreign policy in Ukraine between the East and the West. And the East, as Adwait suggests, is a bit more pro-Russian. So what impact does that have on Ukraine's foreign policy?
Actually, in East, you mean East of Ukraine or East?
East of Ukraine, yes.
East of, oh, okay. So when Russia started its war against Ukraine, we've seen a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians fighting with Russian army to protect Ukraine territorial sovereignty and territorial integrity. So Putin actually helped Ukrainians to be more united and also to identify us as Ukrainians, and actually all illusions that Russia is a good neighbor was disappearing with Russian military troops. And let me remind that from Russian hybrid warfare from 2014, we lost 14,000 of lives of Ukrainians, among them soldiers, among them ordinary citizens, women, children. So this is the price we paid for protecting our independence and our territory. So this is why a lot of Ukrainians, they in Eastern Ukraine, because especially from Donetsk and Lugansk region, they realized that Putin is not bringing peace, he is bringing death as a true killer. And this is why I think a lot of, there is no problem of Eastern and Western Ukraine. I read also Mr. Huntington book, The Crash of Civilization, and also where he is writing about like different parts of Ukraine. So, and also after dignitary revolution, we adopted a law strengthening Ukrainian culture, producing more historical movies, and also protecting the state language and providing decommunization. When we demolished all monuments of Lenin and all Soviet time different people. So this is why the identity of Ukraine as a country with more than 1,000 years of history, so now it's dominating, and people finally realize that Moscow, with its imperialistic behavior, bringing to Ukraine just death, and it helped also to be more united in the face of Russian aggression.
Thank you very much, Hanna, and that's a good answer. And so I think we have time for one last question for a sort of brief minute-long response. And this comes from Osin O'Hare, one of our guests today, and I thank him for his question. He asks, if Ukraine is moving closer to the West and Turkey is moving closer to Russia, what will be this geopolitical situation in the Black Sea if Turkey were to perhaps become more distant or even leave NATO as a result of the current situation? What are your projections on that future possibility?
I do believe that Turkey realized the real threat from Russia, and especially in the Black Sea. And we are conducting a joint military exercises with Turkey, with the UK, US, and other members of NATO in the Black Sea, not allowing Putin to turn the Black Sea into the Russian lake and to have the monopoly. This is why I think that it's in the interest of Turkey to be a part of NATO and to strengthen the security in the Black Sea region. And also, I could say that to stop militarization of Crimea, it's important to continue to work with NATO members and countries like Georgia in the Black Sea. And I cannot believe in such scenario.
Well, that's very prudent advice on which to end, Hanna, and thank you for that. And at this moment, we will come to the end of our discussion, but suffice it to say, it has been a very, very informative one. Hanna has taken us through a whirlwind of themes, all of which are directly relevant, spanning history, spanning civil society, spanning political institutions, the whole infinitum of Ukraine's being is sort of under the scanner in terms of global attention as of late. And as Ukraine grasps through this pivotal period, it's very heartening to see leaders like Hanna in her country serving it and fostering a new place for it within the rules-based international order. So we're very grateful for that, Hanna. We also, I'd just like to re-extend our condolences from the NATO Association for the passing of General Yevhen Marchuk, the former Prime Minister of Ukraine, who, because he passed closer to August 7th, we had to reschedule this event. May he rest in peace, and may he be an inspiration to leaders like yourself, as well as others in Ukraine, for moving it to a new generation and a new period, a chapter in its history. So thank you very much for that, Hanna, and we look forward to seeing more of you, both back at the NATO Association as well as in Ukraine's public life, as both NATO and Ukraine chart a path forward into the future. So I'm very grateful to you for your time today, and I will yield the floor back to our President, Robert Baines, to close.
Thank you so much, Arjun. And what a great job, an elegant discussion from the both of you. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. Hanna, your command of the facts is admirable, and it just shows how much history and good argument is behind the Ukrainian push for NATO membership. And I hope down the road we'll be able to continue this discussion and chart the course eventually of Ukraine gaining a membership action plan. I have 1 minute. I'd just like to ask you, Hanna, if you could say one brief thing about why you think Canadians should appreciate their NATO membership, because a lot of them don't think of it very much.
Dear Canadians, first of all, thanks a lot for supporting Ukraine. More than 120 years ago, some Ukrainians arrived to your country and was among those who make Canada one of the most prosperous with a rule of law and justice system. So actually, a lot of people really dream to have such democracy with so powerful institutions, with so amazing healthcare system. So when nobody could attack you, could just take you into the prison like it's happening in Belarus now. So actually, when oligarchs could not steal your future, and when nobody could grab your territory and start war and killing your people. So actually being a part of NATO means security, peace, prosperity. So do not take it for granted, because now in 21st centuries, a lot of generations, like we are in Ukraine, we are paying price, sacrificing our lives to become a NATO member. So please help us and also enjoy being a NATO member, because this is a really, how to say, it's a privilege. It's a privilege when you live in this privilege, you probably do not recognize. So only losing this, you might realize what you are lost. So actually, thanks God for having NATO, and NATO needs to be enlarged by bringing Ukraine and Georgia, and the democratic space has to be extended, not allowing authoritarian regime to attack democratic values.
Thank you so much for that, Hanna. We will be using that as one of our advertisements for why Canadians should know and appreciate NATO. And for those of you watching, I hope you will continue joining us for our future conversations. And I hope you will join me in thanking both Arjun Singh and Hanna Hopko for such a great conversation today. If you'd like to see our next ones, please join us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram to keep track of what we're doing and the conversations we're having. And please do subscribe to us on YouTube so you don't miss any of our future events. That's it for today. Thank you again, Hanna, Arjun, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Arjun. And thank you for mentioning Mr. Marchuk, who is a true statesman. And I hope in our future project with a model of youth NATO PA, we will work together and will continue the work of Mr. Marchuk one day to see Ukraine in NATO. Thanks a lot.
Agreed.